Good evening, everybody. My name is Linda Gray McKay, and I'm one of the coordinators of the Globalization and Inequality series. And this event is being sponsored by the Church in the 21st Century and the Globalization and Inequality series. We're delighted to have you here tonight, and we're very privileged to have Peter Fan and Roberto Goizueta, who are going to be talking about a different church. I want to let you know that we're going to have a continuation of the Globalization and Inequality series next year, and this will be the last event of this year. We hope that you will keep in touch with us. And right now I'd like to introduce Giulio Giulietti, the director of the Center for Ignatian Spirituality, who's going to introduce Peter and Roberto.
Good evening. It is a pleasure for me to introduce two wonderful human beings. And it's true. And I think you will understand what I mean when you hear how they speak and what is of importance to them. But first, let me give you a little background. Peter Pham is a native of Vietnam and is a professor of theology and holds the Ignacio Ellacuría Chair at Georgetown University. You may remember that Ignacio Ellacuría was the president of the LAUCA, the University of Central America, in the 1980s, and was one of the Jesuit martyrs there in November 1989. So Peter's new position at Georgetown is in his name and honor. An expert on Catholicism in Asia, and actually many Asian religions, Peter has a dual doctorate. He may have more, but I'm aware of two. One from the University of... have three? Okay. One from the University of London and one from the Pontifical Salesian University in Rome. He may have a fourth, but he hasn't talked about it yet. Recently, he was the president of the Catholic Theological Society of America, and in his spare time, he also writes on a variety of theological themes. Let me mention a few: anthropology, Christology, ecclesiology, spirituality, liberation theology, religious pluralism, and a host of others. He is the author of 10 books that at least I'm aware of, and probably more, and has written, I think, over 250 essays and short pieces. Currently, he is the general editor of 20 volumes by Orbis Press, Mary Knowles magazine, Mary Knowles' work, on the systematic theology in a global reality. Peter's most two recent books, both of which I read and was inspired by, need to be mentioned. One is In Our Own Tongues, which is a perspective from the Asian view on mission and enculturation. And the other book is Christianity from an Asian Face. Let me speak a moment now about our other speaker this evening. It's Roberto Goizueta. Roberto is a native of Cuba, and he is a professor here at Boston College in theology. He is the president-elect of the Catholic Theological Society of America and past president of the Association of Catholic Hispanic Theologians of the United States. He recently He received his undergraduate degree from Yale University and his doctorate degree from Marquette University. The National Catholic Reporter, which is a national Catholic newspaper, noted that he is one of 10 of the finest theological writers and speakers on the Hispanic American reality. His book, Comenzando con Jesús, together a Hispanic Latin Theology of Accompaniment received the Catholic Press Association Book Award some years ago. His wife, Elizabeth, teaches here at Boston College in the Romantic Language Department, and together they have 3 children.
Thanks so much, Julio, for that very kind introduction. I really want to express to you how grateful I am to Linda, to Julio, to Dave, and to all of those who have helped put together this program, because I think the issue that we're addressing is a crucial one, and I think one that unfortunately doesn't often get addressed too much in discussions of globalization or in discussions, for that matter, of Catholicism in the Catholic Church, which is that we live in a Catholic Church today, we participate in a Catholic Church, which is a predominantly third world church, to use the common term. Not only a predominantly third world church globally, but even within our own country. By the end of this decade, a majority of all American Catholics, U.S. Catholics, will be Spanish-speaking. And yet, that remains a pretty invisible reality for some reasons that I'll talk about in a few minutes. So I think it's really important, and it's especially important, I think, as we go through a period where many of us feel depressed and disillusioned with what we understand the Catholic Church to be. It's important to realize that our corner of the Catholic world is indeed a very small corner, and that there are areas and peoples and communities within the Catholic world which remain vital, growing, energetic, and provide a different face to Catholicism, perhaps, than most of us may be familiar with. And in fact, you can see that even in Boston. You don't have to go to another country. You can go often across the street or across the city or to the other side of the tracks and see a different Catholicism, one that I think can give us a great sense of hope. I'm reminded of Raúl Juliá, the Puerto Rican actor who performed the part of Romero in the film by that name. And when he was filming that movie in Mexico, he was a quote-unquote fallen away Catholic. But his experience of filming Romero in Mexico and his experience of the people and of the Catholic Church that he saw in Mexico led him to come back to the Catholic Church, and he became very active in the Catholic Church, and then very sadly, shortly thereafter, died himself. So that there's a Catholic reality that I think we're not seeing very often. And what I'm going to address here is some reflections. I'll offer you some reflections on the Latin American and U.S. Latino aspect of that multiple and rich reality. And I'm particularly honored to be on the same stage with Peter Fan, an old friend, who will offer you an engaging, I'm sure, presentation and funny, probably, presentation of the dynamic Asian reality in our Catholic Church. In 1999, Pope John Paul II issued an apostolic exhortation, which was entitled Ecclesia in America, the Church in America. And he used the term America in a very conscious and intentional way. That is, he argued in that document that we ought to reflect on America as a single entity. I have a Methodist Cuban-American theologian friend, Justo Gonzalez, who has said on many occasions that that he is shocked by the arrogance of one country taking for itself the name of an entire hemisphere. To talk about the United States as America is to, in a sense, write off millions of people who live in America. And what the Pope does in that document is to insist that America is one entity. And in fact, when you look at the Vatican statistics on global Catholicism, for the Vatican, America is looked at and studied as one demographic entity. And I think you all know that with the borders becoming increasingly porous and increasingly artificial, that in fact, more and more we can talk about America as a single entity. Almost half of all the world's Catholics live in Latin America, and exactly half of the world's Catholics live in Latin America, are Latino if you include the U.S. Latino community. About 2/3 of Latin American and U.S. Latinos are Catholic, and as I mentioned before, by the end of this decade, a majority of U.S. Catholics will be Hispanic. When we talk about the U.S. Latino population, on the other hand, we're talking about a very diverse population. The term Latino and Hispanic, as many people have observed, is an artificial term. So there are Cuban Americans, Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, Central Americans, etc. Nevertheless, there are some common elements, and I want to talk a little bit about how these common elements might influence the Catholicism of the future, the Catholic Church of the future. Some of the common elements, of course, are language, and also the experience of what is called mestizaje, or mulataje, the experience of racial cultural mixture. That is, Latin America is the product of a number of cultures, religions that have blended together over the generations, over the centuries, and that mixture is reflected in the culture, is reflected in the language, is reflected in the faces of the Latin American people. And another, I would argue, common element to Latinos is the reality of popular religion. That is, religious practices, a spirituality, if you will, that lies at the very heart, at the very core of Latino cultures. Popular religion, the history of popular religion and the significance of popular religion, I think, should be taken into account as we look at the future of Catholicism, both in the United States and globally. And in order to understand popular Catholicism, I think you have to look at the history of Catholicism in Latin America and understand it as distinct from the history of Catholicism in the United States. So from the very beginning, the Catholic Church that comes to Latin America is different. It is at a different stage in its historical development from the Catholicism that comes to the United States or to the colonies. To begin with, the Catholicism that initially comes with Christopher Columbus 500 years ago to Latin America is not Catholicism, it's Christianity. It was prior to the Reformation, prior to the Protestant Reformation. So therefore, it reflected a kind of the worldview of medieval Christianity. And that worldview was one, among other things, where religious practices were central in defining a people. To be a Catholic is not only to believe certain things, which of course that was true, but those beliefs were expressed in and through certain religious practices, the liturgy, devotions, processions, pilgrimages, so that to be introduced into the Catholic faith was to be introduced into a way of life and to a series of practices that involved not just the mind but the body as well. With the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, the issue of confession or creed takes on increasing importance and significance as a way of defining and identifying the difference between what is Catholic and what is Protestant. And this becomes especially crucial in the Catholic Church with the Council of Trent. The Catholicism that comes to the United States first with the English Catholics in Maryland was a post-Reformation Catholicism. It was a Catholicism, therefore, that had been impacted already by the threat posed by Protestantism and by the need to define itself over against the Protestants, the Reformers. The Reformation did not have the impact. First of all, it didn't have the impact that it had on Northern Europe and therefore on English Catholicism. In Spain, it didn't have that impact, and certainly, therefore, it didn't have that impact in Latin America until many generations later. So the issue of what does it mean to be Catholic as opposed to Protestant was not as central and never was as crucial in Latin America as it was in the North. Now, the development, so the Catholicism of Latin America and of Latinos is one that is very much ritually based. It has to do with how one lives one's life, what rituals one participates in, what stories one tells, etc. And children are introduced into these practices, into these stories at very early ages. So that confession then, or creed, is not as central, and that continues to be reflected today in the fact that many Latinos participate in different churches and indeed in different religions simultaneously. Something that is inconceivable to most North Americans. That is, that many Latinos are what is called pluriconfessional. They will be Catholics on Sunday and Baptists on Wednesday, or even Voodoos on Wednesday. So that there's a willingness to cross confessional boundaries that really confounds, I would say, the kinds of surveys that are done and the statistics that show how many Catholics have converted to Protestantism or to evangelicalism. The notion of conversion to another religion is one that is very ambiguous in the Latino context, because one could convert 1 week in one direction and convert back in the next week in the other direction. And one of the most recent phenomena, for example, are the number of Latinos who converted to Pentecostalism and now are converting back to Catholicism. So that by popular religion, we're talking about religious practices that have grown up in a community and that reflect the multiple influences, cultural and religious influences of the history of Latin America. Be those religious influences Protestant and Catholic, or be they African, Yoruba, indigenous, Aztec, etc. The famous devotion to Our Lady of Guadalupe is a perfect example of that. That she is a Christian symbol, but at the same time embodies and reflects Aztec symbols. And in fact, the apparition of Our Lady of Guadalupe takes place on Mount Tepeyac, which was the mount associated with the mother goddess of the Nahuas, the Aztec group to which Juan Diego, the indigenous man to whom she appeared, belonged. Another aspect of popular religion and these rituals is that, for the most part, they are led by the laity, which is to say that the Catholicism that one finds generally among Latinos and which is rooted in these rituals, in processions, in devotions, in home altars, is very much rooted in the home. It's in the domestic, what is called the domestic church, and for that reason is often usually led by lay, and especially by lay women, often by the grandmother, who will be the religious leader of the home and of the community. And this for a number of reasons. One very practical one is the lack of priests. That is, that for generations, Latin Americans have suffered a shortage of native priests. Even today, astoundingly, in a continent that is two-thirds Catholic, a majority of Latin American priests are not native-born, are foreign-born. And that certainly is the case among the Latino population in the United States. So popular religion is rooted in the home, is led by lay people usually, and is led by women usually. Now I would, at the same time, I don't want to suggest that it is that popular Catholicism sees itself, or that Latino Catholics see these religious practices as opposed to or over against the official institutional sacramental life of the Church, because much of the symbolism and many of those practices are drawn from the sacramental life of the Church. But I think that one of the major challenges that Latino Catholicism and Catholics pose to the U.S. Catholic Church is precisely how to take seriously, how to appreciate, how to value, how to integrate these popular domestic religious practices into the life of the typical parish, into the sacramental life of the Church. And I'm afraid that given the history of U.S. Catholics, that there is a resistance to popular Catholic faith and popular Catholic practices. For one reason, I think, because it looks like a lot of these, if you've been to, for example, most recently, the Good Friday processions at Latino parishes throughout the city, throughout the country, that kind of Catholicism looks an awful lot like the Catholicism that many of the grandparents and great-grandparents of Italian Catholics, German Catholics, Polish Catholics lived and had in their homes. And yet, when European Catholics came to the United States, those kinds of popular religious practices were derided by the Protestant leadership and by the predominantly Protestant culture. They were seen as examples of an infantile, immature kind of faith that depended on things like statues and processions and stories and altars, etc. And so, to some extent, in order to be assimilated and integrated and accepted by U.S. society, European Catholics had to let go of a lot of these religious practices. And so along come Latino Catholics with similar looking kinds of religious practices, and arguing that these should be taken seriously as expressions of a people's faith, and as expressions of how God is being and Christ is being revealed in the church today. And it's a way of digging up, I think, old memories, some memories which are perhaps not, some memories of persecution by Protestants of Catholics in this country. I mentioned that the priest shortage and the lack of priests, and that becomes exacerbated in the United States. Unlike European Catholics, Latino Catholics have not brought their priests with them. And that's a big difference, I would suggest, between the earlier immigration of European Catholics and the immigration of Latino Catholics, namely that when German Catholics came with their priests and set up their own German Catholic parish, they had a place they could go to pray in their language, to participate in their religious practices, to teach their children their cultural heritage, and from which base they could then move out into the society out of a sense of their own strength as a people. That is not the case with Latino Catholics for the most part. So Latino Catholics come into this country and all of a sudden are thrown into a regular parish and have to swim on their own and learn independently. A further complication is, or difficulty, it comes from the fact that, as I mentioned, popular Catholicism among Latinos is rooted in the home, which means that there is a certain invisibility about Latino Catholics, so that while Latino Catholics may constitute almost half of the Catholics in the United States, if you simply go into parishes, you may not, at certain parishes, obviously, it would be very, very clear. In other parishes, it may not be that obvious. But one of those reasons is simply that to be a Catholic, if to be a Catholic is to participate in certain religious practices and traditions that are passed down from family to family, then the parish is not necessarily the focal point of one's Catholic faith and one's Catholic practice. Which goes along with the fact that it tends to be a lay phenomenon, or lay-led phenomenon. So that it's very possible I'll tell you a story from my own experience. When I lived in Chicago in a neighborhood that was 30 to 40% Latino, and the parish that I lived in was and that I participated in, had as a pastor an Irish Catholic priest, a wonderful man, deeply spiritual man, but completely blind to the fact that he was surrounded by hundreds of Latino Catholics in his parish, and that he was not offering them much through his parish. When I asked him whether he might think about offering a Spanish Mass or trying to reach out to the Latino Catholics, he seemed befuddled, because he truly believed there were no Latino Catholics in his parish, until I dug up the census statistics and brought them to him and said, look, they're here, they're not coming to church, and especially they're not registered. The idea of registering in a parish is inconceivable, I think, to most Latino Catholics. So that there's an invisibility to the Latino Catholic population. There's also a sense in which, because of the emphasis on physical expression of one's faith, that the liturgies and masses in most U.S. Catholic parishes tend to be seen as cold and individualistic, so not attractive to many Latino Catholics. Hence, many begin to attend Pentecostal and evangelical churches. That is, that the Pentecostal churches offer Latinos often a kind of worship that looks a lot more like the Catholicism that they experienced in Latin America than the Catholicism that they experienced in many U.S. Catholic parishes. So I think that among the contributions that Latino and Latin American Catholicism can make to this globalized, global Catholic Church of the 21st century is that they retrieve or maintain alive the importance of religious practices, physical expressions of faith as the way in which we conform ourselves to Jesus Christ. It is not simply through the head, not simply from the neck up, but it is through all sorts of rituals and things that we do, traditions that we participate in, Mass, liturgy, the sacraments, as well as popular traditions, that we become the Catholics who we are. And to myself as a parent, that is an especially critical issue. That is, how do I introduce my children into the religious practices? It's important, for example, that one eat together. It's important that one say a blessing before eating. It's important that one pray together. It's important that one do things together, because our bodies, by doing certain things through our bodies, we literally turn ourselves into a particular kind of people. That physical dimension of popular religion is extremely important. And also, of course, the communal aspect of Latino Catholicism. That is that to be a person is to belong to a community. And that community, whether it's the family, whether it's the neighborhood, whether it's the church, and especially the community of the spiritual community, the communion of saints, define us, make us who we are. We're not just individuals, and oftentimes Latino Catholics see U.S. Catholicism as perhaps too individualistic. So these are just some of the reflections that I have, and that I hope that as we move towards a more inclusive Catholic Church that recognizes the reality that already exists, that we live in a pluricentral, pluriform church, that we learn, particularly in the Western Hemisphere, to see ourselves and to understand ourselves as not simply Americans who live in the North, but as Americans who embrace the entire reality of what is, I believe, a very vital American Catholic Church that we all can look forward to in the future, and that we can all really take pride in as we move to embrace the richness of the many cultures and races and peoples that comprise our American church. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roberto. I am always glad to be the second one, because you always serve the guest the best wine first. And then when you get drunk, then you get second right. Doesn't make any difference. So I'm talking about for 35 minutes that she granted me. First of all, I'm so happy to be at Boston College, because I see old friends here. Old, I mean not in age, but in terms of long-term friendship. And so I look at and I see here people that I knew before. Ken Himes, the all-powerful chair. He's omnipotent here. I think he's somewhere there. And then we have Sean Copeland. She's also current president of CTSA. And you have the president, Roberto Goizueta. 3 presidents of Catholic Theological Society of America in one single place. I mean, you talk about orthodoxy. You can get a better place to get Orthodox doctrine. And so there you have. And then I see friends that I've seen elsewhere, and particularly I have Tina Ostoga. She's the chair of the Department of Theology, the first woman chair of the Department of Theology in the Jesuit school in 500 years, I believe. So she's here, and so that's great. And then, of course, all the other friends. Okay, having said that, I'd like to start out my presentation on Asian Christianity with 2 corrections. The first one is historical, and the second one is demographic. And when I set out that 2 facts, then I start as a context of my presentation. First, historical. The one thing I'd like you to go away this evening with one idea in mind. Christianity has never been, is not, and will never be a Western religion. Historically, this is true. Christianity did not start from Palestine and went to Greece and then moved to Rome, and then from Rome to the part of the world. That version of historiography is absolutely wrong. Christianity has always been, from the very beginning, an Asian religion. Jesus was born in the Middle East. He was not born in the Middle West. He was an Asian. Granted, Middle Asian, but still an Asian. And the first Christian movement did not move from Palestine to Rome. It moved from Palestine to West Syria. And the first country that declared itself Christian was not Rome, it's not Constantine, it's the tiny state called Australia. In 214, way before Constantine appeared on the scene. And the second state that declared itself Christian was the state of Armenia in 304. Rome is way later. And from there, Christianity moved to the east. It has always been that case, but of course we couldn't write history. So you were the first to write history, you put it from the west. Not at all. It's our Eastern religion. And second historiography is that Christianity in Asia did not start in the 16th century. It started very strong on the 7th century already, thanks to the Syrian monks who went to China in the 7th century. During the Tang Dynasty, the Tang Dynasty reigned gloriously from the 7th century to the end of the 9th century. And the first church was built in China, in the capital of China, we call it the Xi'an today. All right? And the first translation of the Bible into Chinese was not done by the Jesuits. It was done by the Syrian monks under the order of the emperor of the Tang Dynasty. And he built a church for them. It lasted for 200 years. Magnificent history. But of course, again, because Asians were not the historians, the first historians, so you had the first, you start writing history, and that's why the history kept repeating. So go away tonight with one idea. Christianity is an Asian religion. Second idea, as a context for my presentation. In another 25 years, a white Christian is as rare as a Norwegian Buddhist. Just as rare. Get over it. Get used to it. This is the fact. In another 20 years, we are talking about 2025 max. 75% of Catholics will live in the so-called third world. First in Africa, Latin America, and then Asia. The greatest challenge to the Catholic Church is not, believe me, is not the encounter between Christianity and Islam. It's between the so-called first world Christianity and the third world Christianity. That's a momentous shift that we are not prepared for at all. We buried our heads in the sands. We still think that Rome is the center of geography. Forget it. Get over it. That's not true anymore. Imagine the Third Ecumenical Vatican III. You recall, Rano says that Vatican II marked the birth of the World Church. Boy, wait until Vatican III, and Rano wouldn't change his mind. In Vatican III, the agenda will not be set by German, Italian, French bishops. It will be set by the Third World bishops. Imagine the majority of bishops will come from Africa, Latin America, and Asia. Now that's sort of the second idea you want to go away tonight and start think about, because the kind of Christianity will emerge will be very different. And that's why I entitle my lecture tonight, A New Way of Being Church. First of all, Roberto talks about Latin America, and we share Asian Christianity and Latin American Catholicism share a lot of similarities, precisely because it was Iberian Catholicism that was brought to Latin America as well as to Asia by Portuguese and Spanish missionaries. But when I talk about Asia, this is what I mean, because Asia is such a big umbrella. So let me define what I mean by Asia and then Asian Catholicism. By Asia, here I refer to the land containing the regions referred to Western Asia, which contain 25 nations of the Middle East and Central Asia, South Asia, 7 nations, Southeast Asia, 11 nations, and Northeast Asia, 7 nations, altogether 50 nations. That's I refer to as Asia. Now, even though Asia covers only 30% of the land mass, Asia is the home of 60% of the world population in the year 2000. That is about 3.7 billion people out of 6 billion. Now, this number, this demographic shift, represents a tremendous rate of growth. From 1950 to the year 2000, the Asian population increased by 104%. Now, the Vatican's latest Annuario Pontificio, published in the year 2002, reports more than 1.07 billion Catholics worldwide. Now, out of this, 10% of these, 10.3, are in Asia. So about 107 million Catholics in Asia. About 28% total. Okay? When we look at the number 6 billion, okay, 6 billion, and about 104 million Catholic, plus about 200 million Orthodox and Protestant, all this made up only 3% of the Asian population. It's very important for me to get this. Christians in Asia make only 3%. Now, if I were Jesus, I would fire all the bishops and the priests. After 500 years of mission, that's what you get. If I am a CEO and I have a good product, I send out salesmen, women, and sell the product. After 500 years, only 3 people out of 100 buy the product. Something is wrong here. You see. But that's the fact. That fact then makes me rethink the whole notion of mission, what it means to be mission, and above all, it forces me to rethink the whole notion of being church. What is being Christian in Asia? Now, in order to go to this, answer this question, I appeal to 2 facts. Very important event in the history of Asian Christianity, and particularly Asian Catholicism. So I will leave aside for a moment Protestants. Now, of the 104 million Catholic in Asia, about 70 million live in the Philippines. And you have one here representing 70 million, right? So you are talking about the rest. 0.2, 0.1, that's all. If you live in that world, how would you be a Christian or Catholic? Now, in this country with 87% Christian, you go to the supermarket, you meet Christians. You go to the bar, you meet Christians. In Asia, you turn to the right, you see Buddhists, Hindu, Muslims. You turn to the left, you go in front, you behind, you are 1 out of 100. In other words, you are a minority. You cannot expect to have that sort of political influence. You cannot expect to have that sort of economic influence. You cannot have that kind of voice that everybody will listen. There you don't teach, you learn. You don't go out there and say, I have the truth to teach you. You are just one person out of 100. You have to listen first. You live among them. You are one of them. You have no privilege whatsoever among them. You are just barely 1% out of 2% out of the entire population. So two events occur in Asian Catholicism. The first one is 1970, when Pope Paul VI visited Manila. There were about 230, 40 bishops from all Asia met there, and all of a sudden they get the idea. They said, why don't we do something like the Latin American bishop? The Latin American bishop have the CELAM, the Conference of Latin American Bishops. They say, we should do something like that. Because, remember, we in Japan, 0.2%, in Thailand, 0.2%. You can talk. So we need to get together. So they talked to the Pope. The Pope said, that's a good idea. They talked to the cardinals. The cardinals say, that's a good idea, but go slow. All right. So 2 years later, in 1972, they formed this wonderful, they called it FABC, Federation of Asian Bishop Conferences. If you talk about reform of the Catholic Church, renewal of the Catholic Church, reception of Vatican II in Asia, there you have to zero in. The Federation of Asian Bishop Conferences, founded in 1972, and the Federation has a lot of offices or associate offices where each of them meet once. The Federation meet every 4 years, but in between all these offices meet, produce documents, help the entire Asian churches to move forward. So that's number one. Number two is the so-called Special Assembly of the Synod of Bishops for Asia. You know, Pope John Paul II celebrated the year 2000, and he convoked the 5 assemblies of bishops, one of which is for America, for 5 continents. But I have to say objectively, without any bias whatsoever, the best of the 5 assemblies is the Asian Synod. Absolutely. In terms of theology, in terms of ideas and so forth, the assembly of the bishops for Asia is the best, the most challenging, the most fresh. I have the whole book on that to show you that, to prove the point. It met in 1998, and a year later the Pope issued the Apostolic Exhortation, which a friend of mine wrote it, you know, and it was promulgated in New Delhi, November in 1999. Now, when you read this document, both the discourses and interventions of the Asian bishops at the Synod and the ensuing document, you find that there is something new about being church. Because this time, they do not speak out of some kind of, previously established texts. They talk about experiences of being church as a minority in Asia. It comes from their experience. One of the bishops, he is a Capuchin from Indonesia. You know, every bishop has 8 minutes to talk. If you're over 8 minutes, they turn off the microphone. Okay? So this guy come up and, very humble Franciscan, addressing the Pope was there, all the cardinal was there, and Cardinal Yan Shot, the guy, the Secretary General was there. And he said, very simple, he said, please remember that we, the Church of Asia, we are not the branch offices of the Vatican. They said that if looks can kill, he would have been incinerated on the spot. Because they say, we are not branch offices of the Curia. We are truly church. We are truly church. Yes, we are in communion with you, but you also commune with us. You teach us. Now it's our turn to teach you. And the Pope was sitting there. And the Curia was sitting there. Because here they come telling them, this is the way we become church in Asia. And this is the way how we church in the next centuries. So what is this new way of being church? Let me summarize it in one sentence. The way of being church in Asia is kingdom-centered, not church-centered. It's a kingdom or reino-centric, you want the Latin term, or basileia. To be church for Asian bishops is simply an instrument to a goal, and that goal is the coming of God's reign. Being the church is not the center of the church life. The church in Asia exists there not to promote expansion of the church, more people to come to the church, more churches, more dioceses, or more universities, or more colleges. All those things are useful, but they serve only one purpose, and that the reign of God. Anything else, they said, is superstition and blasphemy. If the kingdom of God is made to subserve the church, it's idolatry, they said. Like the sun around which the earth and the other planets move, the reign of God is a center around which everything in the church revolves and to which everything is subordinated. In the place of the church, the reign of God is now installed as the ultimate goal of all activities within and without the church. Now, both what the church is and what the church does are defined by the reign of God and not the other way round. The only reason for the church to exist, they say, is to serve the reign of God. If only during the crisis of the so-called clergy abuse, sex abuse, we remember this theology. It's not to preserve the good name, the reputation, the budget of the diocese, or to protect the clergy, but to produce justice for the victims. That kind of ecclesiology would have been so different from what kind of church we face today. Now, the point of all this, the bishop says, is not to devalue the role of the church, but to determine it correctly with regard to the kingdom of God. Of course, the Asian bishop knew that there is a connection, intrinsic connection between church and reign of God. But the church is but the seed of the kingdom of God. She is not the goal. The church does not exist to serve the church, but the church to serve the reign of God, the reign of justice, of peace, of reconciliation, of forgiveness, of unity and harmony. How do you do that? The Asian bishops suggest three things, and it's almost like a mantra that we keep repeating and repeating. They said, in Asia, the only way for us to be a Christian or be a Catholic is to be in dialogue. And the way to carry out our mission is to be in dialogue. Now, the term dialogue is such a, used and misused and overused term. And unfortunately, in the West, when you use the word dialogue, you immediately conjure up the image of a luxury hotel, five-star hotels, where theologians Genheim and John Copeland and Roberto meet together and discuss ideas and so forth. Of course, that's not what we mean by dialogue at all in Asia. What they mean And this is the Vatican sometimes misunderstood. The Vatican accused the Asian bishops or Asian theologians to substitute dialogue for evangelization. But if you read all the dialogue, you never had that idea. What they mean is this. They mean it's the only way you do evangelization, ministry, anything that you do in Asia, you do through dialogue. Dialogue is not one activity among many of the activities of the church. Dialogue is the modality in which you do everything in the church, out, in and out of the church. And dialogue, they say, is not talking. Dialogue, they say, there are 4 ways of care. Always. He said, first, you really dialogue. You cannot dialogue unless you share life. You live with them. And you can avoid doing it. It's not by choice. It's by necessity. I mean, you go to the market, you want to buy, you can't just choose to the Catholic store and you buy meat. You buy from anyone. Because 99% of them are not Catholic. So you have to live with them. Share life with them. Your next door neighbor, in front of you, behind you, everywhere, they are not Catholic. So you have to learn to live with them. Secondly, they said, you have to walk with them. Common action. How do you expect to change the society in Asia? It's only at 3%. You have to work with others before you want to change society. For a just society, for a peaceful society, you have to work with the others. You're only 3%. You can't do it by yourself. I mean, the last thing you need in Asia is so-called unilateralism. You can't do that. Third, they said, is religious sharing of religious experiences. That's the deepest level. When you start praying with them, you start being a monk with them, monastic traditions. You start meditating with them. You start praying to the same God. That changes your life. That changes who you are. When you sit down, kneel down, and prostrate with the other, the same worshiper of the same God. If you have that kind of experience, you can't go around saying, we are saved, you are not. You just simply can't. Let me tell you a story. This happened in the year 2000. The year 2000, 40 of my families came back to Vietnam. 40 members. The fans are very productive. 40. We came back, 40 of us, visit Vietnam. My mother was with me. So I took her to the school where I used to teach. Near the school there is a Buddhist pagoda, beautiful pagoda. I said, Mom, would like to see? Oh, she said, sure. So we all went in there. And then she met a young Buddhist nun. She must be about 30-ish, 40. So she started talking to her. I said, are you a Buddhist? Yes, I am a Buddhist nun. How long you been? Well, I started when I was 6. I was 6. What do you do during the day? Oh, I just pray. I just pray for all people. What do you get up in the morning? Oh, 3 o'clock in the morning. We get up, we pray. So my mother, who is absolutely conservative, talking about Tridentine Catholic, you can get a better one, And here she comes in front of, you go into the pagoda. There's a huge statue of the pagoda. Beside there are 2 other statues. And I was standing here, and she was standing here, and we just said, she said, let's pray. I said, Mom, it's the Buddha. She said, the Buddha was a good man. Okay. She has never read my works on interreligious dialogue, anything like that. She started praying, so I just prayed. And then she put out her wallet. I said, Mom, no, you can pray, but keep the money for the Catholics, Put in the basket. What changed her mind? Not theological dialogue, not reading books by Ken Hine, no, not. It's a conversation with that nun. She realized that the Buddha or Buddhism cannot be bad if that has shaped the life of that woman. Sharing religious experiences change you. And then fourthly, if necessary, theological dialogue. Get those theologians together and they talk and they write books. Fine. Necessary, yes. Keep somebody jobs, do. But that's not the first thing. That's what the Asian bishop means by dialogue. It's a modality of doing things in the church and outside the church. And finally, they suggest a dialogue touches three areas of the church life. The first area, you dialogue, you listen, you learn from the people, especially the poorest among them. So dialogue in Asia takes the form of liberation. Without the work of liberation, there is no church mission. It's a constitutive dimension of the church mission. You have to, because Asia around it, the poorest country in the world is in Asia. And the greatest number of poor people in Asia. And we have a history of colonialism is in Asia. And the globalization hurt the people most in Asia. All these things the bishop said, talk. That's what you dialogue. Dialogue is just go and work with these, with them, not for them, with them, sharing with them. The second one is dialogue with their cultures. The rich cultures, the ancient cultures of the Indians, of the Chinese, of the Filipinos. And this tradition, thanks be to God, has been started by the great missionaries, the Jesuits from Matteo Ricci to Roberto Di Nobili to Alexander Rode, and continue down. It has been a tradition. And the Jesuits should be very proud of it, as they are the one who initiated and continue to do it. That the cultures, and lastly he said, you have to dialogue with their religions. The deepest level of dialogue is their religions. You cannot separate religion from culture in Asia. That's the way how they are. They are religious and they are culture, the same thing. So to engage in this threefold dialogue, liberation, inculturation, interreligious dialogue, in the fourfold way, living with them, working with them, praying with them, and necessary discussion with them, the Asian bishop says that's the way how we will be church in Asia. And that's the only way how Christianity can survive. Therefore, the question is not to get how many Asians into the church, but how to bear witness to God's reign among these people. Because God's reign is really present among them. It's a way of being church, I suggest, for the 21st century. And if we in this country too will learn how to live these experiences of the Asian churches, I think there is hope for Christianity. Thank you.